Okay, so I'm going to take a somewhat different approach. I'm going to take you through the entire text of Tianyun, going through the first three zhang in some detail. Actually, basically, the Chinese text if you want to refer to any of that. And then adding my own observative interpretive way. And then I'll go through the last three zhang in more summary fashion. And maybe this might have the advantage also of helping us to a full picture in mind, consider someone like we did with Wim's paper, ponder whether there's any kind of intended coherence among the authorial or editorial, or whether there's assortment of passages. Okay, so reading through it. Does heaven move about? Does earth dwell in place? Do the sun and moon contend for their positions? Who presides over and unfolds this? Who maintains and ties this all together? Who, residing with no task, impels these into motion? Could it be that they have that which triggers and binds them unavoidably? Could it be that they move and revolve with no ability to stop on their own? Is it the clouds that make rain? Is it the rain that makes clouds? Who raises these up and lets them loose? Who, residing with no task, urges us on with indulgent delight? The wind rises in the north, now heading west, now heading east, swirling back and forth up above. Who breathes it in and breathes it out? Who, residing with no task, fans it forth? Dare I ask, what is the cause of? So I think worth noting somewhat as an aside is that this opening paragraph bears a striking resemblance to the kinds of questions set forth in the first half of the recently unearthed manuscript, Fangwu Liuxing, which, much like much of this paragraph from Tianyun, is rhymed. Now, the manuscript text begins as follows: as all things flow into form, by what attainment do they take shape? Flowing into form and taking shape in bodies, by what attainment are they able to? And later on in the manuscript, there are passages with even greater resemblance to the Tianyun opening, such as this one. Now, when the rain comes, who spits and sweats it out? Now, when the wind comes, who sends it forth by breathing it out? And we see somewhat similar passages in the chapter, the Tianwen chapter. And here, going back to the Tianyun passage, you can really see the close resemblance. Now, in the Zhuangzi passage, Guoxiang and Cheng Xuanying see all the questions as rhetorical ones, with the implied answers being that that all these various entities of the natural world simply operate of themselves without any behind them. In this respect, they recall the central question of the panpipes of heaven passage, Yiwulun. Who is it that rouses it? This is just one of a number of resonances between this passage and between this chapter and now a recurring term in this passage is wushi, with no task. And this term is itself inherently, but it can have either negative or positive connotations depending on context. Within the Zhuangzi, it is at times an ideal attribute, as in the Dazhongshi chapter. For those who dwell amongst each other in the Tao, their lives are stable without serving any task. Or in Dasheng, wherein the attained man is described as someone who roams at ease in a taskless occupation. But elsewhere in early literature, it can also be the source of mild derision, as when Peng Geng says to Mengzi, it is improper for a man of service to receive sustenance without serving any task. Or it can simply be the occasion for which one should not do something, as with the ritual regulation that unless there is some specific task or engagement that calls for it, one does not open the gate to the temple. Or when to burn a lamp without a task to perform is described as the 10th of robbery, just to name a couple of examples. So I suspect that the term may have a similar connotation in this opening Tianyun passage, in the sense that someone or some higher entity who has no specific task of his own to perform should indeed not perform any task. So what business then does this higher entity have to mess about putting other things into motion and to derive such apparent pleasure from it at that? As the fisherman guest in Yu Fu puts it, to serve a task that is not one's own, this is called monopolizing, one of the so-called 8 human flaws. And so this is no doubt meant to apply to this as well, at least I suspect that. Now, as it turns out, the question posed in the opening paragraph of Tianyun, the questions posed there are intended to be understood as actual ones posed by some unknown interlocutor, to which a certain shaman Xiantiao subsequently appears here to provide a kind of cryptic answer that does not really answer anything. Shaman Xiantiao said, "Come, I'll tell you, heaven has its 6 standards, or perhaps 6 extremes, and 5 constancies. And if the sovereigns and kings accord with them, there will be order, but if they go against them, there will be misfortune. With the tasks set forth in the 9 books from the Luo River, this is perhaps a reference to the Hongfan chapter of the Shangshu, order is achieved and virtue is replete, shining down on the earth below, and all the world supports it. This is called the august sovereign on high. There may well be something vaguely ironic in the response of the shaman, who by profession is better suited than anyone else to communicate heaven's ineffable will to the rest of us. Insofar as it includes such numerically precise categories and even a vague reference to the ostensibly heaven-sent text now enshrined in the very classics that the Confucians study and staunchly embrace. But whether his answer here is to be taken as an enlightened reply or one still somewhat burdened by the stale traces of past tradition, its central message nonetheless appears to be one that indeed resonates with the rest of the chapter, or even Zhuangzi as a whole, which is to say, don't question heaven, just go along with it. Okay, so at this, Qianyu now moves on to a different dialogue, this time one involving Master Zhuang himself. Dang, Grand Minister of Shang, i.e. the state of Song, asked Master Zhuang about the virtue of humanity or humaneness. Master Zhuang said, "Tigers and wolves are humane." Dang asked, "What does that mean?" Master Zhuang said, "Father and son hold no affinity for each other. Father and son hold affinity for each other. How is this not human?" Dang said, may I inquire about ultimate humane?" Master Zhuang replied, "Ultimate humaneness holds no affinity." The Grand Minister, Dang, said, "I have heard it said that with no affinity there is no caring, and with no caring there is no filial piety. Is it acceptable to say that ultimate humaneness is unfilial?" Master Zhuang replied, "That is not the case. For ultimate humaneness is lofty. Filial piety is inherently insufficient to express it. This expression, that one that you recount, is not one that speaks of surpassing filial piety, but rather one that does not reach the point of filial piety. For when one traveling south reaches Ying, turns his head north, and is unable to see Mount Ming, why is this? It is because he has gone too far from it. Thus, it may be said, to be filial through external respect is easy, but to be filial through genuine love is difficult. To be filial through love is easy, but to forget one's parents is difficult. To forget one's parents is easy, but to cause one's parents to forget oneself is difficult. To cause one's parents to forget oneself is easy, but to forget all of the world is difficult. And to forget all of the world is easy, but to cause all of the world to forget oneself is difficult. For one whose virtue leaves Yao and Xun behind and acts to no purpose, and whose munificence extends to myriad ages without anyone in the world being aware of it, how could he merely heave a great sigh while speaking of humanity? For filial piety, brotherly love, humanity, propriety, loyalty, fidelity, uprightness, and honesty, these are all terms by which one exhorts oneself to send one's virtue on errands, and they are not worth making much of. It is thus said that with ultimate honor, all ranks of the state are cast aside. With ultimate wealth, all the assets of the state are cast aside. And with ultimate eminence, all reputation and fame are cast aside. For this reason, one's Tao is never sullied. So here we have a sustained dialogue on the idea that conventional virtues only serve to delimit or even contravene what we might refer to as natural virtues. A notion similar to what we find in chapter 18 of the Tao Te Ching. You all know this passage. Only where the great ways abandoned do humanity and propriety come into being. Only where knowledge and wisdom come forth does great artifice arise. Only where knowledge and wisdom only where the 6 relations are in disharmony do filial piety and parental affection come into being. And only where the states and households are in turmoil do loyal. What's interesting, however, is that in the current passage, understanding these higher virtues as in some sense natural virtues becomes problematic, as they prove to be something that only humans are capable of achieving. Wang Fuzhi puts the matter well. I'll go ahead and read this. The humaneness of tigers and wolves is indeed of the type that is unavoidable, and because it is unavoidable, it is close to what is so of itself. However, what is not self-so about it is that these animals hold an affinity when spurred on as father and son, and thus they have that which triggers their humaneness, forth, utilizing words from the text here, whereas they are inhumane towards those that are not their fathers or sons, and thus they have that which binds them to cease it. When they have that which triggers them forth and causes them not to forget what they take as their errands, their humaneness is quickly sullied, and they go to the inhumane. Thus, tigers and wolves bite other creatures in order to feed their offspring, and they thereby become the assailants of them. This being the case, to strive to show love and respect and serving these errands as virtue, such a form of humanity is simply the humaneness of tigers. Those that have both forgotten the world and are forgotten by it, on the other hand, are not partial towards their parents, and their parents are partial towards them after that. Now, while one could perhaps easily read too much into this, It is notable that this particular comparison with the natural world of animals that we find in Tianyun is quite a bit different from the kind we see in many other parts of the Zhuangzi, such as in the Qi Wulun chapter. And you all know this passage very well, but I'll go ahead and read through it anyway. Now let me try asking you. People become paralyzed below the waist when they sleep in wetness, but is this true of the loach? When they live in trees, they live in fear of falling, but is this true of apes? Who among the three knows the correct place to reside? People eat grass and grain-fed animals, deer eat wild grass, millipedes have a sweet tooth for snakes, and kites and crows relish the taste of rats. Who among the four knows the correct flavor? Apes take primates as their mates, elk copulate with deer, and loaches swim with other fish. Mao Qiang and Li Ji are admired as beauties by humans, but when fish see them, they submerge deeply. When birds see them, they fly off high, and when deer see them, they quickly bolt away. Among these four, who knows the correct form of sex appeal? So in Qi Wulun, humans are, or at least ideally should be, on par with other animals. We should, as they do, just focus on, if I may quote the Jungle Brothers, doing our own thing, and not try to impose our own particular worldview on anyone or anything else. But in the Tianyun passage, on the other hand, the ideal of living with virtue is expressed not in terms of simply living like the rest of nature, but rather to, in some sense, overcome our animal, or perhaps all too human, instincts through a process of self-forgetting that leads us to an altogether higher form of humanity. Okay, so the notion that self-forgetting and the attainment of the Tao is indeed a kind of process through which we must be led is reinforced by the next passage of Tianyun, which describes a sagely form of musical therapy. And I'll try and run through this without dwelling on it too long, because I know Sojong is going to talk quite a bit about it. So this is the chapter of the music of the harmonious pool. Bei Chengmen, accomplishment of the North Gate, literally, asked Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, when I first heard the music of the harmonious pool that you, my sovereign, displayed in performance in the wilds of Dongting, I was frightened. When I heard it a second time, I was exhausted. And when I heard it for the final time, I was befuddled, shaken, silenced, and unable to recover myself. Now, Bei Chengmen may not realize it, but through the process of listening to these three performances, he is slowly becoming enlightened. What may seem to him conventionally as negative self-reactions paradoxically lead him imperceptibly to a kind of almost mystical unity with the Tao. His final inability to recover himself, or more literally to attain himself, reminds us of the state of spiritual enlightenment of Nanguo Ziqi in Qi Wulun, who has lost himself, metaphorically speaking, having come to hear the panpipes of heaven, Tianlai. The three performances here, in fact, roughly parallel their largely unelaborated distinction between the panpipes of heaven, panpipes of earth, and panpipes of man, panpipes of earth, and panpipes of heaven alluded to in that opening Qi Wulun passage. And I see now from that Sojong has actually brought this up before in the best sense, yes, at least for. So here, Huangdi first responds to Bei Chengmen's reaction to the initial performance. Huangdi replied, "You were bound to feel like this. In the first instance, I had it performed with a human, but attested it through heaven. I had it conducted with ritual propriety, but established it through great purity." And then we have these bracketed lines. For the utmost in music must first be made to resonate with human affairs, and yet accord with heavenly patterns, be conducted through the five virtues, and yet resonate with what is so of itself, before it will bring the four seasons into ordered attunement and the myriad things into great harmony. Evidence seems to suggest that these were actually an annotation in some text, which itself then continues, and here, assumedly speaking of the performance itself as in nature, the four seasons arise in succession, and the myriad things are born along with them. Now prospering and now declining, the civil and martial are sorted into order. Now clear and now turbid, yin and yang are harmoniously attuned, their tones resonating in shimmering rays. And when the hibernating creatures first awaken, I have them startled with thunderous booms. The conclusion of the music is without end, and its beginning is without a start. Now dead, then now alive, now toppled, and now arisen. It takes limitlessness as its constant, and it has nothing upon which one may await. It is for this reason that you were frightened. So Huangdi's musical performance, at least in the first instance, is one in which the symphonic movement of the orchestra and perhaps dancers, programmatically captures the cyclical course of nature itself. With no clear beginning or end, it strikes those accustomed to the clear demarcations of human social life as unsettling in its limitlessness, though it in fact reflects nothing but the natural order of the cosmic interactions of heaven and earth. Nonetheless, performed with the human and conducted through ritual propriety, it was never intended to leave the human realm behind. The civil and martial, for instance, are as much human manifestations of natural propensities to growth and decay as they are seasonal attributes of the natural world itself. The utmost in music, in this first performance, necessarily entails the harmonious attunement of human affairs with the way of heaven. One does not negate the other. The second performance, however, appears to leave the human world behind altogether. So the second time I had it again performed with the harmony of yin and yang and illuminated with the brightness of the sun and moon. Its tones could be short or long, could be soft or hard, changing and transforming in even uniformity, and espousing no established constant. When in valleys, it filled the valleys. When in hollows, it filled hollows, patching in the gaps while upholding its spirit. It took all things as its measure. Its tones were expansive and rich, its signifiers lofty and bright. For this reason, the ghosts and spirits remained in their secluded places, and the sun, moon, stars, and constellations traveled along their proper paths. I had this performance come to rest where it reached its limits, while letting it flow wherever it was ceaseless. Wanting to ponder it, you were unable to understand it. Wanting to observe it afar, you were unable to see it. And wanting to pursue it, you were unable to reach it. Absent-mindedly standing on the path that is empty in all directions, and intoning along whilst leaning against a withered parasol tree. The eyes and intellect reach the limits in what one desires to see, and one's strength is depleted by what one desires to pursue. Perhaps I in the sense of self, must already have failed. When form fills up the empty voids, one thereby arrives at the freely meandering. You became freely meandering in music, and thus exhausted. So now performed with the harmony of yin and yang and illuminated with the brightness of sun and moon, the second performance, as the Song Dynasty scholar Liu Huiqing emphasizes, is not said to involve humans at all, but is rather depicted as derived entirely from the constituents of nature itself. The regular order that marks both the human world and the observable patterns of the natural world by which humans live their lives is no longer apparent, as the music meanders with fluid freedom to go wherever it may. Much like the panpipes of earth, it is the wind that simply fills up whatever crevices and hollows it encounters and speaks through them in the capacity of their own individual voices. A certain order still lies therein, but it is no longer an order that holds to any established human standard, leading its listener to a state of perhaps blissful exhaustion, freely meandering along with it and relaxed to the point of utter indolence, to speak to another sense of dai, metaphorically leaning against a withered parasol tree and simply absent-mindedly intoning along with the free-form pipings of nature. Now, with this last image, we have direct parallels with descriptions of Huizi in a certain state in both Chongfu and Qi Wu Lun. But here, perhaps more strongly evokes the latter's image of Nanguozi as he sat leaning against a table, breathing out as he looked upwards toward heaven, there detached, and described by his disciple as having a form that resembled a withered tree and a mind, an enlightened state that reaches its full form with the third performance of Huangdi's heavenly panpipes, so as it were, now played with tones that are in themselves inexhaustible. So this third time, I had it performed again with inexhaustible tones and attuned with the mandate of self-affirmation. It was like a muddled chase of a thicket of arisings, a forest of musical entertainment without any form. It unfolded and expanded without being pulled, sounding secluded and dusky without any discernible tones, in motion toward no direction and resting in deep obscurity. Some call it dead, some call it alive, some call it fruitful, some call it flowery. Traveling, flowing, dispersing, and relocating, it espoused no constant tones. The world of men holds it in suspicion, leaving it for the sage to examine. The sage is one who comprehends the true nature of things and follows in accord with nature's mandate. With the 5 sense organs all equipped even before their heavenly trigger lets loose, this is called the music of heaven, in which one's heart takes delight without it even speaking. Thus, the head of the Yan lineage extolled it thus: listening to it, one does not hear its tones, and looking at it, one does not see its form. It fills the expanse of heaven and earth and envelops the 6 extremities. And here, just a pause to show you how close this last part is to lines attributed to Kongzi from the opening passage of the Kongzi Xianju, the Shanghai Music. Anyway, now back to the conclusion of the dialogue. You desired to listen to it, but were unable to make contact with it or to receive it, and thus you were befuddled. So now performed with inexhaustible tones and attuned with the mandate of self-affirmation, we are now at a stage where, as Liu Huiqing puts it, we have forgotten both man and heaven, and simply entered into heaven. Ru Yu Tian, maybe it's Tiandi, I think. Or as Wang Fuzhi puts it, it was first performed in accordance with the human, next performed in accordance with heaven, and lastly performed in accordance with things, such that the evenly uniform process of transformation is complete. The description here still resonates with that of the panpipes of earth from Qi Wu Lun, as the harmonious cacophony of a thicket of arisings and a forest of musical sounds. And yet, like the question posed about the panpipes of heaven, we have no idea who blows the wind that brings this natural symphony forth in the first place? Who is it that rouses them forth, as Nan Guoziqi puts it? Or as the opening of Tianyun puts it, to go back to the first slide, who presides over and unfolds this? Who maintains and ties this all together? Who, residing with no task, impels this in? The music simply unfolds and expands on its own without being pulled, moving about in no particular direction and adhering to no constant tones. Only the sage is able to enjoy it, having left behind his worldly doubts in full acceptance of the natural mandate of spontaneity, thus freeing himself to fully enjoy the formless and toneless music of the entirety of existence. Bei Chongmen, perhaps because he still desires to make contact with it, finds himself in a state of utter befuddlement. But such a state of confusion paradoxically ends up bringing him in accordance with the Tao. As Huangdi's final response concludes, this music is such that it began with fear, which resulted in spiritual mischief. I had this followed up with exhaustion, which resulted in escape, and had it conclude in confusion, which resulted in foolishness, results in accordance with the way, wherein the way can carry you and you can stay together. So, my question is, has the music really changed with each performance? Or has Bei Chongmen simply learned to hear it differently each time, a process of self-forgetting? This is not entirely clear, but the ability to hear harmony in the cacophony of existence is in any case dependent, I would argue, on the degree to which the listeners themselves have freed themselves from conventional constraints and established standards. Okay, now the last few dialogues of Tianyun all involve Kongzi. The first is subject of discussion and exemplar of philosophical futility. And again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to read through all these remaining dialogues, but let me just quickly run you through. So the setting here is that Master Kong traveled westward to Wei, and Yan Hui asked Music Master Jin, "What do you make of my master's journey?" And Master Music Jin replied, "It's a pity. Your master is bound to reach a dead end." And he goes on to explain, first, the Kongzi teaching his disciples the established virtues and rituals of the former kings is akin to trying to reuse the sacrificial straw dogs after the sacrifice has been concluded and they've lost all of their ritual reverence. And this is precisely why Kongzi has met with so many nightmares, so to speak, in his travels, since his ways are no longer applicable to the present. Insisting on implementing the ways of the past in the present day is then metaphorically described as seeking to push a boat on land. It's described as seeking to push a boat on land just because of its capacity to travel on the very different medium of water, which is of course, an exercise in futility. And so, the sovereigns of antiquity, says the music master, did not venerate uniformity, but rather venerated order. And their rituals, proprieties, standards, and measures are here compared to haws, pears, tangerines, and pomelos. Their flavors oppose one another, but they are all delicious. And then his conclusion states the matter plainly. Thus, rituals, proprieties, standards, and measures are things that change in response. And trying to force the ways of the past on the present is then compared to trying to clothe an ape in the garments of Zhou, which never goes over too well with. The dialogue then concludes with yet another colorful analogy, which I'll go ahead and translate here. The beauty Shi once, when suffering heart pain, walked about her village with a frown. Upon seeing her, an ugly woman in the village found her beautiful and, on her way back home, likewise clasped at her own heart and walked through her village with a frown. When wealthy men of the village saw her, they shut their gates tight and did not come out. And when poor men saw her, they grabbed their wives and kids and quickly moved away. The woman knew only that a frown could be beautiful, but did not understand the reason why it was beautiful. What a pity. Your master is bound to reach it. Now, aside from a few unique touches and subtleties, there's really nothing all that Zhuangzi. The same view of historical change, the need for practices to change with the times and the foolishness of rigidly adhering to the past, can of course be found and indeed emphasized in the so-called legalist texts like the Shangjun Shu and of course especially the Hanfeizi. But it's of course no surprise that the Zhuangzi, which is all about riding out the changes, would adopt such a view of historical precedent. The theme continues in the final two dialogues of the text, which both involve Kongzi with Laozi. In the first of the two dialogues, Kongzi at the age of 51 has still not heard the way of the true way, so he seeks, who then asks him where he's been seeking it. And Kongzi tells him that he sought it in numbers and measures, and he sought it in the yin and the yang, but alternate. And so Laozi basically tells him that the Tao cannot be transmitted because, as he puts it, it will not come to rest where there is no internal host, and cannot be put into practice where there is no external target center for it to strike. Here the interpretation of Zheng, if it even was Zheng originally, is a matter of some debate. And he goes on, if what comes from within cannot be received externally, the sage just does not put it out there. If there is no internal host to receive what enters from without, the sage does not store it away. And then getting back to the idea of established virtues being in some sense valid for their time, but only for their time, He goes on to say that humanity and propriety are the postal lodgings of the former kings, only good for a single night's stay and not suitable for long occupancy, whereas the attained men of antiquity merely borrowed roads in humanity and trusted their lodgings in propriety, and thereby roamed about in the wilderness of adopting what men of old called the wandering that chooses authenticity. And then Lao Tzu's final lines here stress that those who take wealth, prominence, and power as their sources of information live trembling in fear, trying to hold on to them, and are really sad when they lose them, and completely unable to reflect upon their worldly obsessions. They are referred to as people who have been punished by heaven. Corrective, or perhaps governmental measures such as seizing, bestowing, admonishing, and instructing have their uses, but only those who follow it in accordance with the great changes and who have nothing that mires them down are able to employ them. For all the rest, like Master Kong, the gates of heaven will not open. Which is to say, in conclusion, that Kongzi has been looking for Tao in all the wrong places. And the final dialogue of Tianyun then has Kongzi again seeking audience with Lao Dan, this time discussing humanity and propriety, by saying that even such small things as scattered chaff and mosquitoes and horseflies can cause blindness, pain, and irritation, let alone such annoyances as humanity and propriety. He then bespeeches Kongzi not to let the world lose its unadorned nature, and suggests that Kongzi himself should just go with the flow instead of clinging so bombastically to his conventional virtues for the sake of distant grandeur. And then he famously, as in Da Zong Shi, compares Kongzi and his crew to fish struggling for survival. When the river's spring dries up, fish dwell together on the land, breathing on each other and to keep moist and damping each other to froth. It would be better for them to forget each other. Kongzi then returns from his audience so distraught that he doesn't talk for several days. And after his disciples finally ask him what advice he may have following his audience with Lao Dan, Kongzi compares Lao Dan to a dragon who cannot, like other animals, be chased down and captured, but rather rides upon the clouds and vapors and is essentially unfathomable. And as you can see, there's a lot of possible textual corruption in this particular passage. Now, upon hearing such a lofty description, Zigong then wants to get a glimpse of Lao Dan himself, and so he goes off to see him. Whereupon Lao Dan greets him somewhat coolly and with a ritually inappropriate posture, and asks Zigong whether he came with something to admonish him. Zigong responds by saying that the 3 kings and 5 sovereigns each ruled the world differently, but they were as one when it came to having a reputation. And yet you, elder sir, are alone in not considering them to be sages. How is that? Lao Dan then asks him to come closer and elaborate, and Zigong briefly details the differences between Yao Shun, Yu, Tang Wen. And at this, Lao Dan asks him to come closer yet again, and then breaks into a long spiel about what the 3 august monarchs and 5 sovereigns of antiquity really accomplished in their so-called rule, which devolved from unifying the people's minds to making them partial toward their kinfolk, to forming caste-like groups, to accepting sanctioned violence, and finally ending up, here perhaps somewhat anachronistically from the mouth of Lao Dan, with the philosophies of the Confucians and Mohists taking, all of which served only to pervert the natural order so that everyone lost their true nature. And yet they all shamelessly label themselves sages. This naturally all leaves Zigong. And the interesting thing here perhaps is that we're no longer concerned so much about changing with the times, but more that all rulers have imposed artificial distinction on humanity. It's just that things have gotten progressively worse in a constant state of devolution through the accumulation of further and further distinctions and designs spurred on by the introduction of partiality. Anyway, we then have Kongzi once again talking to Lao Dan and telling him how, despite being so well-versed in the 6 classics, for some reason he has been unable to persuade a single ruler in spite of all of his attempts to do so. So difficult it is for his way to be undone. At which Lao Tzu is forced to rebuke him once again, reiterating his point from earlier that the 6 classics are just like the obsolete traces or the remnant footprints of the former kings, and not the Tao itself. Basically, one just needs to walk one's own Tao, which is unique to every individual in every era. Just as Lao Tzu puts it using colorful analogies, each species has its own unique form of mating and reproducing. As long as one finds one's proper way, all is good, but if not, all bets are off. And then finally, after 3 months of thinking it through, Kongzi comes back and exclaims that he's got it, now giving his own colorful examples of how different animals reproduce differently, and then lamenting, how long has it been that I have not acted as a human partner to transformation? Having not acted as a human partner to transformation, how could I be able to transform others, or something to that effect? And at this point, Lao Dan basically says, word up, Chiu, you've got it. And then that's how. Please, you, and then Frank.
Okay. So at the beginning, you mentioned that Gao Zhang takes initial questions at the beginning to rhetorical, and that beings sort of generate themselves. But Yeah, and I thought when you mentioned that, I thought maybe you would mention someone else's interpretation or a different of this question, or like answer who or what generates the thing. So yeah, I was wondering if you got
If you mean what my own take is, or
your own take or other important, historical.
I don't know that I don't know that I've seen any explicit contradiction of Guo Xiang's take on it. I think, yeah, I think it's just generally seems to be generally accepted that there, or at least it's a question that is unanswerable, a question that posed, not maybe not necessarily saying that the implied answer is that there's nothing that rouses them. It would definitely be a genuine question. Say, well, what do we really don't know. We really can't know, and I don't know. Though I'd like to hear others, whether it's this passage or like the Qi Wulun, Nu Zhe Qi Xie. If anybody else has another take on how to read, because I think these passages really are closely tied together.
About the
Yeah, I mean, I tend to see them as pretty much aligned. There is such a thing as virtue. Or obviously, it depends on what. So there's something akin to Ren and Yi. Good. It's just like humans. Except for that one problematic part I talked about in terms of calling them natural virtues. But there is this kind of general distinction between natural virtues and these conventional virtues that the Confucians and Mohists cling to, and sort of over-determining exactly what those virtues entail. But it's not to say that the sort of the fundamental impulse behind Ren and Yi are themselves bad. No, those are good things, right? It's just that when you come along to impose your own idea of what is Ren and what is Yi, and which may have been different for a different time and different circumstance, or and everybody's your own individual perspective. That's where you get into trouble. So I think that it's kind of that sort of relationship between a sort of a higher form of Ren and Yi, or what? How does he put it? Like when he says that what you're referring to as Xiao is not. Yeah, right. So yeah, the distinction between Zhiren and sort of conventional Ren seems to be more or less. I think it seems to more or less hold throughout the entire chapter. Much different from but much different from the kind of Ren and Yi acceptance that you have in Tian Dao as part of like the maybe later on in the sequence, but definitely positive there, right? This is a different kind of take on Ren and Yi than you see in say Tian Dao.
But still positive. Still positive.
Positive, unless we're talking about Ren and Yi, specifically the conventional virtues of Ren and Yi. But if you're talking about like a Zhi Ren, Zhi Yi, I guess. That's my take. Yeah, sir.
I'm curious about the relationship of these Kongzi Laozi dialogues to Dao De Jing. Do you think this is a form of Dao De Jing commentary? Because there's several familiar phrases like the straw dogs and the like Tian Dao. Is it Tian Dao? Tian Di Buren, Tian Dao Wu Qin. Yeah, but the Tian Dao Wu Qin particularly, like, and then he says, is Ren not filial then? He's like, no, it's like more than filial. It's almost like it's trying to kind of solve the problem that those lines, those hard lines
create. I think you're right in a way, or at least it's playing with the Dao De Jing, whatever form the Dao De Jing, the Lao Tzu may have taken at that point in time. It does seem to be playing with those passages.
Because I wonder if like the figure, like what's the figure of Confucius doing, therefore, like, if you think of it like, I think of it as like a Confucius puppet, right? There's like a Confucius puppet. And like, what's the Confucius puppet doing, sort of asking these Zhuangzi guys about, asking Lao Tzu about like Confucius stuff. He's almost like sort of trying to defend himself, but then he's sort of not doing a good job, or I don't exactly know like what the placement is, but it feels like it's a setup. It's like a puppet show about philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he definitely comes out on the bad end, on the short end of the dialogues in this chapter. Yes, Sonia?
I'm now afraid my question will be too specific, but about the virtue issue, about the comparison between Ren and Xiao, humanity and filial piety. Do you also read that the difficulty of like ranking one above the other, right? do you also read that comparison to be about comparison between natural / immediate kind of virtues versus the more cultivated ones, and the difficulty of ranking them, and they are like north and south in that sense, they're just directions. So I was wondering if you also have a take on that. And finally, thanks to your presentation, that I noticed, Diego, that's another metaphor of mobility that we don't talk about. We talk about the heaven patterns of wheel, Dashu, the pivot of Daos, as the paradigmatic tropes of mobility in Zhuangzi. And then here, there is a well sleep that goes up
Right.
and down.
Right.
So that's another
in a
trope of
couple of the
mobility
chapters
to
that we're reading,
throw into
yeah.
the mix.
Yeah, I mean, so that passage is, it's basically saying that, yeah, I mean, there's the ultimate of Xiao, or you could say the ultimate of Ren, is, yeah, it's paradoxically not, not treating your parents with any particular, I mean, it's a Xiao that goes beyond your own parents, let's put it that way. So it's a kind of a universal, a Xiao that somehow faced all partiality. And so, I don't know, that's where that really interesting comparison with the animals comes in. What is it? What is he saying there exactly? With it's not that's even tigers and wolves have ren. I think. I mean, I tend to agree with Wang Fuzhi's interpretation there. That's it is kind of saying that it's sort of pejorative in a way for the reasons that he mentions, because. And so there is something uniquely human about it, which is really interesting to me, because I'm not sure. Again, if that, I mean, this is a question I would like to hear more of your views on. How does that work in conjunction with the rest of the Zhuangzi, right? The humans are, in a sense, capable of something higher than the rest of the natural world, which seems a little odd.
I think one example of that, though, is the Niechui Wang Ni dialogue, right? That seems to start out like with this parallel, but then ends with the spirit people who don't care about life and death. And that seems to be making a contrast with the initial description, which is all about eating, shelter, and reproduction. That human beings aren't locked into those things in the way the other animals are. I'm just reading a little bit into the passage, but it's hard to see how it works. And the whole thing seems to establish like Li and Hai as norms for every animal.
Okay, yeah.
And then it reverses that to say like they're not norms for the Shen. I think it's Shenren there, because fire can't burn them and these things. So that seems like at least one example where we transcend transcend other animals.
So I have a similar question about that part. So you seem to say there's kind of natural kind of affection, like by animals, natural virtue, and also there's conventional virtue, but there seems to be higher kind of virtue. So from the perspective of higher virtue, is natural virtue and conventional virtue are equal kind of relationship, or I think similar? So I didn't really follow how they situated.
In a way, I mean, because he kind of equates ren. I mean, he says even tigers and wolves have ren, basically, right? And by doing that, he's kind of putting limitations on what your conventional ren and yi are. So I don't know if that he fully impacts that to say whether there's the animals the sort of natural animals, the natural ren and yi of animals is that somehow distinct from the conventional ren and yi of the Confucians and Mohists, but at some level he kind of roughly equates them to say precisely that there's this higher form of zhiren. So at least rhetorically he's equating them on some level.
So another question is in the presentation you raised a very interesting question whether is music change us or it is because us changes that we listen to the music differently. So it seems that your position or your interpretation is the second one, or is there any chapter somehow support either way, or?
I mean, it's consistent with the way I read the Tianlai passage in the Qi Wu Lun as well. I mean, I think on a certain level it really depends. It's really as much about how we listen to the world, how we experience the world, and that determines whether we hear it as a cacophony or whether we hear it as a harmony. A harmony of differences, a harmony and which is the way we should hear it ideally, but we have to kind of, through some sort of process again of self-forgetting, get to that level. I think I kind of come down the side that in a sense that, I mean, I don't know, because that could be overreading the Huangdi passage though, because Huangdi specifically says, well, the first time I performed this way, the second time I performed it that way. But I still think kind of the overall takeaway that they're trying to get from that is that it brings us to a kind of new appreciation of how to listen to music. I don't know, so do you have any thoughts on that, or you want to wait till your talk to? Okay, fair enough. Mark, can I call on you for anything?
Well, no, I'm just still trying to figure out. Quite. I remember we went over this final story, and there are a number of kind of confusing parts of it. The part at the end where he doesn't leave his home, and they're talking about how insects, different creatures reproduce. When you say then become I have not acted as a human partner to transformation, you're saying that that's kind of just like at the beginning there's Ren and there's Zhiren, there's reproduction, but then he's doing Zhi reproduction. Is that how that's what I'm reading your interpretation of with your language as a human partner to transformation?
I wasn't trying to play on the reproduction part with the term partner, but
Okay.
It's you 到为人 or something like human to ren, which is, if you look at parallel passages, it's like saying 与道为友, that type of idea. So I didn't know how else to translate that, to get that sense of to be a person with transformation, like in the sense of a friend of a friend of the Tao, friends with the Tao. So I use partner, but that brings up some other associations that weren't necessarily intended.
Okay. But then what is I guess how is he using all this knowledge about how animals reproduce? What exactly is the metaphor that's going on then?
It's just like you can't force your own ways of doing things on others.
Okay,
basically.
so
and
so
there's
it's-
nothing more natural than, I mean, these tortoises reproduce by up and down. I don't know. I mean, they've got this. I don't know what the exact mechanisms or the way the fish reproduce.
Or
humans can't do
loaches.
it that way, right? Yeah. And so that's basically what it's all about. I think it's just saying, if you look at the way animals reproduce, that's like there's no more natural thing that you can think of that sort of demonstrates the notion that things have to do their own thing. You do you, I do me. Don't insist on your version of Ren and Yi and imposing it on me, because it's going to be different from everybody else. So I think that's the whole purpose of those analogies, because I mean they're so colorful because they speak directly to nature, I guess.
And so how's that tied to the classics and the footprints earlier?
Well, I mean, when you put that in the context of historical change, it's the same thing over time in a way. Like not only is each individual unique, each period is unique as well. So even if there was a Ren and a Yi that was kind of correct for the time of Yao and Shun, if you adhere to it in the present day of the Warring States, it just doesn't work. In the same way that feng ma niu bu xiang ji, right? You can't you're not going to make oxes and horses together. It's the same sort of idea.
Point that we should have different conceptions for Ren depending on the time, or is that Ren and Yi something of the past and should be completely disbanded? I mean,
I guess in the sense that Ren and Yi have at their core some sort of impulse, just a basic human impulse that is a positive virtue. Okay. You could say that maybe the Ren and Yi in a larger sense can apply to every time in their own individual way, but it's basically the problem is what we term Ren and we term Yi is really exactly what the Confucians are defining as Ren and Yi, and that's where the problem is, because. So and again, he's not saying that being benevolent and being and having some sense of what is right is a bad thing in and of itself. But nobody can determine for any age or any individual what that is.
Okay.
That'd be my take on it.
It's interesting because I think this kind of suitable for different ages, or things have to change according to the age. That argument concerning Ren Yi is absent from Tian Dao, for example.
Yeah. Definitely.
It's not something you find in there.
Yeah,
The whole of Tian Dao doesn't have anything to do with the times change and we should adapt or something like that.
Yeah. No, Tian Dao is just such a unique text within the entire corpus for those that kind of read.
This is back to the music one. So I liked, partly because I'm looking for this, like I was asking Eric about these kind of correlation kind of things. And so it seemed like on your reading, the first stage of the music has that kind of correlations between the natural order and the human order, and with the Wenwu in particular. But I'm wondering how you read the passage as a whole then in relation to that. So one way to look at it would be, it's not rejecting that at all. It's just saying there are deeper levels you can look at. So that's all true, but there's, you can keep going deeper and deeper. The other way to look at it would be like, that's not right? The whole thing's actually much more chaotic than that. So that it's more a rejection of that first view. It seems like it's more not rejecting that.
Yeah, I think it's
view.
more your first model, that it's more like deeper and deeper levels of, and the idea that there are different movements to the music as well. You could even say there's no particular form of the music that's correct in and of itself, right? The music is always changing, even in terms of its like relationship between heaven and mankind. Perhaps is even itself changing. Like this idea of we talked about earlier, where the cosmogonic passage, where you're moving from Tai Chu, and then ultimately reverting back to it after you have all this, individual Wanwu are formed, and you move from Tai Chu all the way to form and spirit, and et cetera, but then there's ultimate reversion back to the Tai Chu. And so there's nothing inherently wrong with the human society. That's part of the natural world. But if you learn to like re-merge yourself with Tai Chu, Tai Yi, or whatever happens in that last performance of the music, that's also something that this higher, the Zhiren would ultimately aspire to, is getting back in touch with that one's origins and so this higher mystical unity with the Tao, if I can use that term. I know Chet Hansen doesn't allow me to use that mystical, but the M word, but I just use it.
Will you publish this presentation somewhere?
Huh?
Will you publish this annotated
I don't
presentation?
know.
No?
I don't know.
Can I share it with my students? Just given that they will not be distributing, it's very helpful.
Sure.
You can say no, but okay. So you don't know if it will come out as published work or not.
Who knows? I can't predict the future, but yeah, I'd have to put more work into it, though. But yeah, no, feel free to. Just let me know if you have any suggestions for.
You asked question because if my question is related to my presentation because we are actually he's giving overview and then I will focus on the music, so it will come out to my presentation start. So that's why I'm a little bit reluctant to say anything. I think the Sonia has question, right? Just before. No. So
She
that's
wants
why
to wait. She wants to wait.
Yeah, I'm still waiting.
So like I don't want to take away from others.
Well, you have to fill the silences.
And
somehow.
please allow me, just let me know if I'm talking too much. And I'm sorry if you already covered it and if I missed it. With the it's a reproduction passage and there is a footprint business. The footprint is and the mention of still footprints. I wonder if we could suggest a parallel between that passage and the wheelwright passage, about the written word being left over of the sages, and it is in the it was in the final slide, and I think that must be in the translation, the final page. So for the 6 classics are the remnant footprints or opposite traces of the former kings. How could they be? Blah, blah. So it is the last page, and it's the last slide here. And maybe it's because we just also had Wim's presentation that it really resonated with the wheelwright passage and the complaint about the written word there.
But it's so different in terms of, at least according to Scott's explanation, that it's what's distinctive about human beings as a species is that they are always changing, is what you're saying, or they're what the appropriate way to manage their society changes over time.
I'm not saying that that's what's unique about them, but rather that it seems that only humans are capable of overcoming partiality, I guess, or getting to this higher form of true Ren. But yeah, it's probably true. I mean, I guess it's hard to know what kind of historical development there is in the animal world. I mean, the thing is, yeah, so the footprints are just footprints. You make the footprints when you walk, but then somebody who just wants to study the footprints, follow the footprints, they're not even walking, right? They're just trying to retrace the past and missing the whole point of what they're missing the Tao itself.
I mean, I can perhaps say something about the footprints if you want to. I
Please
mean,
do.
I wrote an entire article just on prints and D, in the that's coming out in like July or so with Albert Gavani. And I think, I mean, what's interesting in that specific passage about the linking of procreation with traces is that I think it picks up on a whole bunch of different discourses that are directly connected and associated with the term D, right? And that D becomes this defining factor of all kinds of myriad beings and of being alive, right? So that Xing, being able to move and so forth, leaving traces behind, that's then also always read through the context of giving birth. And I think this text plays with all of these different kinds of connotations that Z basically has at the time, because during the late Warring States, it also obviously becomes associated with D, with records and with writings. And so I think this is kind of this back and forth between what kind of traces, right, are the real ones? Are these the written ones? Are these the procreative, active traces of the one U? So where can you find the? And then he basically makes fun of Kongzi, right, thinking that he thinks the can be found in texts, whereas the real the, not the virtue, but the power of the Tao can be found in Hua, in transformation, and in this case in life and death. And procreation is part of this larger framework of Hua, of the, right, as a form of transformation. And that's at least how I always read this passage in this context, why there is the term trace. So I don't think it's just footprints. It really, it alludes, that image alludes to an entire range of associations that were prevalent at the time.
Yeah, I mean, footprints is just like the core metaphor there. I mean, the G itself
Yeah.
is but yeah, it's larger than that.
Tobias, could you explain footprint and you said giving birth?
Yeah, I didn't quite.
Could you connect these dots for us?
Well, I mean, the most important one is Hoji, right? Like how
stepped
he's
onto a
born,
footprint, yeah,
is
see.
born by being stepped into a footprint, right? So I mean, there's already that connection very clearly there. And I think what it just is when you look at early texts, right? D is directly associated with the fact that the myriad beings are defined by the bodily form, which inevitably leaves traces in this world, right? So that's a difference than when the Zhuangzi and later the Huainanzi then make the Tao as that is traceless, that is Wuji, so that because it gives birth but it doesn't die itself, right? So trace is oftentimes then directly associated with the process of giving birth and dying.
But in her case, didn't it work? I mean, it worked. I mean, she stepped on a footprint and then she got impregnated with Hoji. So it all worked
Exactly.
out, which is something different from what's happening here, right?
So you should read the classics, right?
Well,
Right. The G work.
well, yeah, or as monks have said, you don't believe everything you read in books. I don't know.
No, I mean, I didn't mean that, that. So I'm just saying, like, traces have these associations. So I think what a text does, it uses them in both directions, right? It uses them for writings, which was a common context within which the term trace would be utilized, and it uses it in the context of procreation, where the text would be utilized. And it basically makes the argument that the one, right, that thinks the real traces of the Tao, of the Tao's De can be found in text is looking at the wrong spot, because it can be found in procreation as the traces of the Tao's De. That's, I think, the logic behind the passage.
I'm still going with Sonia's point. Like, if it's associated with reproduction, which I believe because this passage associates them so clearly.
It's all about procreation, right?
But why? But what is the baby the trace, or are you the trace? Yeah. Like, how does it work? How does that association, aside from Hoji, forget Hoji, like, because that's one myth, right? But how is G specifically associated with procreation?
I mean, that's what you leave behind, right?
So your baby is the trace.
Yeah, the ones that come after you. I think that is the trace of the power of procreation that is performed in the Wan Wu on a regular basis. So the Tao basically, through the act of procreation, lets the De act through our bodies, by us basically performing transformative activities on a regular, continuous basis.
Can I jump in?
Please.
Yeah, I'm not sure the connection I'm making is perfectly relevant, but I was looking at the passage, and in the, the last bit it talks about these different animals, and then it says, "Xi yao zhe hua." So this, it brings it back to this connection between she, which I guess is understood to mean a kind of wasp, right? That reproduces through transformation. And then Confucius talks about transformation of people, right? And there's a strange passage from Yang Xiong where he uses the analogy of education with a kind of, what is this animal? A kind of wasp that is a parasite, and it lays its eggs in another bug to then reproduce itself through what from the outside would look like hua. And so there's this gaze over this earworm and says, be like me, be like me. And then after a time, the worm becomes like the wasp. And so then he says, this is how Confucius had 70 disciples become like him. So, it's not reproduction in the way we think of it in modern biology, but, well, I guess, it's parasitic reproduction, right? You're transforming someone else into yourself, not through, like, as a child. It's not your child that you're passing on your traces to, but you're reproducing yourself through education and transforming as a kind of parasitic, right? Your Liu Jing are parasitizing the thought processes of these people who then become like you.
Yeah,
I don't know. That's that connection might not work, but it's still an interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the commentaries, I don't remember which ones, but some commentaries make that interpret that precisely that way.
Okay.
I don't know myself that it really applies here. As you said, it's kind of, but it is an interesting way of thinking about it. And yeah, there are commentaries that I don't know if it's probably not in Guo or Chung, but maybe in some of the later Qing Dynasty or Song Dynasty commentaries. If you look at the Zhuangzi Jixi, I think that interpretation's in there somewhere. So yeah, there is that is brought out, but yeah, I'm not quite sure if it works in this particular passage. But that thinking about it.
You would think hua is more like the cosmic da hua or qi hua or this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Although he says an neng hua ren, implying that his desire is to hua ren.
Well, Confucius' desire is to hua ren.
And since he's Confucius, it seems like that sense of hua ought to work.
But now he's sort of forsaking that, basically. He says, I'm not going to try and change others. I'm going to be a partner in transformation with the Tao.
I'm not sure I agree with that.
Okay.
Maybe. I can. He says
He says an neng hua ren.
Right, but he's saying at the beginning he's complaining why I'm studied the classics. I'm so good at them. Why don't rulers listen to my advice?
Right.
And Lao Tzu says it's because you don't meet them where they are. It's basically like you're not showing them the right stuff. And he goes away and thinks about that, and he's like, oh, here's this. Now I understand. I need to be more like a wasp. I need to lay my eggs in them, and then he's like, okay, no, I have to do this thing, and then. So I think the other way you could read an neng hua ren is since I wasn't able to yu hua wei ren, I couldn't hua ren. So I need to yu hua wei ren, then I can do what I want.
Maybe. I'm sure still not sure about the wasp parasitic thing in that context, but
this sounds like an old-fashioned way of doing it, but is this just no? Maybe not. I'm sorry. It's just when you look at the language about the where it talks about you've never met where'd that go? When you've never met the ruler who somehow I've completely lost this. Yeah, so Zhishu Dejun is the ruler who's able to adjust things to his. There are these Confucian discourses that are very similar to this, like in the Wu Xing, right? So the ruler who's kind of able to, because he has the Tao, that's always applicable to whatever generation he's born into, right? So that's the shoe, right? And the footprints are just the traces of those rulers in previous ages, right? So in previous ages, such rulers were that type of ruler, but all we have is the classics, and that's the footprint, right? So in which case, the whole elaborate thing about reproduction is simply talking about kind of having the Tao in that sense, right? What is, and it's the mating practice, right? I mean, it's the two members of the species, how they find each other and mate, right? So it's the similar matching yourself to the particular age that you're in.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. I think there's probably a lot more there of the hua at the end, the hua and the jiao hua de hua, and these specific feng hua de hua in these passages that I should probably think about to unpack a bit more, because that does make a lot of sense. That there seems to be some, now that I think about it, there's some sort of play of ideas going on there.
Scott, you just, I mean, I can send it to you at some point. I think just keep one thing in mind, that is like, so in Zhi Bei You, there's a passage that talks about the mutual reproduction process and associates it directly with the fact that the beings have form, right? You Xing. And you can ask, Frankie was writing about that, and the conceptualization, right, of Wan Wu, that one of the defining factors of Wan Wu, and then particularly later at the time, in contrast to the Tao, is that the Wan Wu have form, and by having form, they do move. So you Xing, right? And then because they move, they actually inevitably leave traces in it, right? So this is a discourse that was around at that time. And that discourse is directly associated. So having a form is associated with the traces, but it's also directly associated with giving birth. And I think, what you find is, and that's what the article is about, is like during that time period, there was a fight over, right, where can the real Tao can be found in the powers of it. And that I would make the argument that the Zhuangzi and some other texts, or some of these passages we find in Zhuangzi, directly address the discourse that the real traces of the sages of the Tao of the Taoists, in that case, of the right actions, can be found in the six classics, and that the Zhuangzi here clearly addresses this double meaning or multiple meaning of the term trace. And so procreation is really part of this vision of the term ji, and I think that's exactly the ingenuity of the passage, that it jumps on these terms like having a form and to perform and trace as a kind of a linking thing to push back against this vision, right? That the real teachings of the sage kings basically can be found in texts, by saying you don't need anything, just look at the world, and the world is performing, and the traces of the Tao can be seen just by the way how the myriad beings are constantly keep on living, even though they are dying, right? So I think there's really a strong association of De with Sheng, Si, and Hua that is utilized as kind of the real principle behind the real De in this world, rather than this kind of vision that is associated with rituals and so forth, that was purported in other writings at the time. I can send it to you, and then, you can look at it and ask yourself whether it makes sense to you or not. But I do think the term trace is heavily, it's a heavily
So
utilized.
what you're saying, though, is he's pushing back against a discourse in which Ji is associated with, in a positive way, with this idea of reproduction and procreation. But he's pushing back against that in some way.
No, I think it's that way. It really says like procreation is the way to figure out how the world works, right? So I think what this passage tells us is that perhaps there is oftentimes a vision of sexuality that is far more positive in some of these texts than we oftentimes think of it, because in other portions of the Zhuangzi you get these elements, right? Like that too much sex and emotional arousal, and we know from the Xin Shu and so forth, but that this is not what you're supposed to do, right? And I think there is here just a very positive reading of just how the powers of the universe or the powers of the Tao manifest in this world in the process of giving birth on a regular
No,
level.
I don't disagree with that. I'm just still trying to figure out how traces fit into that when they're viewed negatively in this chapter and in other chapters of Chenji.
Because it has a double connotation.
Where
It
you
can take
cannot
me
find the
both.
Tao.
It switches its connotation in that moment. That's exactly the point, right?
All right,
So the
I think
term
I'll have to read your paper and kind of
Is-
get a better idea exactly what you're saying and see how that works out. But,
Yeah.
I would like to bring something up. I'm not sure if I followed everything. So it's about the same passage. So about the mating there in connection with the Chenji. Couldn't it be that, so he says, luckily you haven't met this 知识的君,
Yeah.
right? And so you rely on writings, and writings are not immediate. They're an intermediary step. And so they're traces, they're traces, they're footprints, they're not the shoes, right? So
Or they're not the
yeah,
steps. Yeah.
we read books. Books are our intermediate access, mediated access to the 知识之君. If you would really meet a 知识之君, the impact would be immediate. And isn't that what is conveyed by this mating, the 那个白, whatever it is, 相识, without the pupils, whatever. So it's something, isn't? Sorry, I'm a bit tired. So, isn't it the idea of immediate impact versus books that are like standing in the middle between you and the 知识之君? And if you had met the 知识之君, the impact would be immediate. And so, not sure if we need to make so much out of it.
Out of the.
I mean, of this. No, out of the. Yeah. Anyway.
But I do see a relationship possibly between the 知识之君 and because in a sense if we read 知识之君, it's the ruler of a well-governed age. There is such a ruler, and that's a ruler who rules through Wu Wei of not intending anything, right? And that's kind of the stage where what Kongzi has to get to if he wants to successfully Huaren, I guess, to get back to Esther's point. But then I guess the question is, why is it a pity? Maybe because he could have learned from him, or because
Are you taking Xing to be a good thing or a bad thing? Is it a good thing?
Well, it's fortunate.
A bad thing?
So literally, it's fortunate. How fortunate it is that you haven't met you have not encountered the ruler of a well-governed age. If that's how we read 知识之君 and not as a ruler who is ruling the age, which would be a different way of understanding it altogether. And I don't know if it was Cheng Xuanying or whoever said it's basically because, well, he would have laughed at you. That's why it's a good thing you hadn't met him. So I don't know.
I will say the commentators really like Misha's wasp breeding, or Misha likes the wasp breeding because of the commentators. It's pretty strongly, like they all agree this is wasps lay eggs on other things
There's
and
a
make
few
those
of them,
things
yeah.
like them. Yeah.
Well, I was just checking in. That's Guo Xiang.
Oh, it is Guo Xiang, okay.
Guo Xiang, he's so influential for reading Zhuangzi throughout the ages that it makes sense that other
people would agree with him. Yeah.
Go along with him. But I hadn't read Guo Xiang, so that was just my random connection that apparently someone else made before.
Yeah.
Wait, you're telling me
just
that
a short time ago. Yeah.
you knew about parasitic wasps that were called Xiyao without reading this commentary? That's crazy.
No, I have to think, because about, how long ago? I think over 10 years ago, I edited a volume on parasites and worms in sort of comparative religious studies. And one of the articles was on this exact passage about the parasitic worms in Yangsheng. So I should properly cite my source. Hold on.
You edited a volume on parasites and wasps.
Mark Pinter, I believe, was the one who wrote the article.
Whoa.
That's awesome.
That's amazing.
And if you read, it's also translated in Readings in Han Chinese texts. I just want to point that out. So, but it's not just the wasp though. It's also herons, right? And it's insects.
I thought it was fishhawks.
Or fishhawks, right, Guan. But I mean, there's a whole set of animals.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, we can't really apply that same reading to the other animals.
I don't think fishhawks do that. Do they?
You don't think they do that? We need somebody who's written an article on it and edited a volume on it to tell us.
I mean, I think the reason why I made the connection is because you have the list of all the different kinds of reproduction. The last example is the wasp that huas,
Yeah.
right? It reproduces through hua. Then there's the discussion about xiongdi, and like I don't know how that plays into the sequence, right? And then you talk about Kongzi and his hua. So the xiong you xiong are you di are xiong ti, right? I don't know how that logic works in the reading I'm trying to give, because if you're trying to make the connection between the wasp's hua and Confucius's hua, why would you put that bit in the middle?
In the middle, yeah.
And if your point is that each does according to their nature, then
Right.
it
Yeah.
would seem to actually rule that out. But, you know,
Yeah, that's why I thought maybe it wasn't so relevant here, but it is interesting to think about it in that connection with Hua. We got zero time, but you can go last question. Okay, well, then let's end it there. So let's take a 15-minute break, and then we'll give Sojang the floor. Thanks.